The whole town of Red Hollow had watched her step off the stagecoach. And not quietly either. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Boots stopped scraping against wooden planks. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Clara. Bennett adjusted her grip on the single, worn suitcase she carried. She was taller than most men gathered near the saloon porch. Broader in the shoulders, solid in a way that made people uncomfortable when they didn't know what to call it. Too big, they would say later, too much. The words followed her like dust. Clara had grown used to that kind of welcome. At the far end of the street, leaning against a hitching post, stood the rancher who had sent for her. Eli Turner didn't whisper. He didn't stare the way the others did either. His gaze was steady, measuring without being cruel. Sun had carved lines into his face, and his hat cast a shadow over eyes that looked like they'd seen droughts. Fires and survived both. "You Clara?" he asked when she approached. "Yes." He took her suitcase without comment, as if its weight didn't matter, and neither did the stairs burning into her back. They rode out of town without another word, hooves thudding against dry earth. The ranch sat wide and open beneath a stretching sky, fenced in oak and hard work. It wasn't grand, but it felt sturdy. Inside the main house, the air smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. A single wooden chair sat near the fireplace. Clara noticed it immediately. Chairs had never been kind to her. Eli set her suitcase down and gestured toward it. "Just sit down." She hesitated. "You sure?" His expression didn't change. "Just sit." Carefully, bracing herself for the familiar creak of protest, she lowered her weight. She waited for splintering, for that humiliating crack that always followed. Nothing happened. The chair held firm, solid as stone. Her eyes lifted in surprise. "Built it myself," Eli said quietly. "Oak beams underneath, reinforced the legs. Figured if something's meant to carry weight, it ought to be built right." His words lingered between them, heavier than the air. "You expecting someone like me?" she asked, searching his face. He didn't look away. "I build things to last." For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Clara felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not shame, not defiance, possibility. The ranch tested her before the sun had fully climbed over the hills. Clara was awake at first light. Sleeves rolled, hair tied back, boots already dusted from the yard. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that bit at your lungs and made weaker people complain. She didn't. She followed Eli toward the barn without waiting to be told twice. Hay bales were stacked high, uneven from the last delivery. One of the ranch hands, a wiry man named Tom, gave her a doubtful look. "Those aren't light," he muttered, not quite under his breath. Clara didn't answer. She bent, slid her arms around a bale, and lifted. The weight pressed into her forearms, but her stance held steady. She carried it across the barn and stacked it cleanly against the far wall. No wobble, no struggle. Tom blinked. By mid-morning, sweat traced down her spine. Fences along the east pasture had sagged from last week's windstorm. Eli handed her a coil of wire and a hammer. "Fence line's weak past the creek," he said. "You testing me?" she asked, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. His gaze stayed level. "No, I'm trusting you." That word settled differently than any challenge could have. Trust meant expectation without mockery. It meant he believed she would manage, not that he hoped she would fail. They walked the pasture together, boots sinking slightly into soft earth. When a post leaned too far, Clara braced it with her shoulder while Eli drove nails in tight, sharp strikes. At one point, the plank slipped unexpectedly. She caught it mid-fall, her grip firm before it could slam into his arm. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if recalculating something. "You've done this kind of work before," he said. "Had to," she replied. "When people think you can't handle something, you either let them be right, or you don't." A faint curve touched his mouth. Approval, not amusement. By afternoon, the other hands had stopped staring. They simply worked. Clara noticed the difference, but didn't comment. She didn't need applause. She needed ground that didn't shift under her feet. As the sun dipped lower, Eli stepped closer to inspect the finished fence. His hand brushed against her sleeve, dusting off dirt that didn't bother her in the first place. The touch lingered a second longer than necessary. "Town thinks you won't fit here," he said quietly. Clara lifted her chin. "And you?" He glanced over the wide stretch of land, then back at her. "I think this place was built stronger than it looks." Rumors in Red Hollow didn't fade. They fattened. By the third week, Clara's name traveled ahead of her boots. At the general store, conversation dipped when she entered, then rose again in careful murmurs. She felt the weight of it between the shelves of flour and lamp oil. In the pause, before the clerk handed her change. Too big for a dress like that. Too loud when she laughs. Too much for any man. She kept her spine straight and her voice even. If she shrank now, they'd call it proof. When she stepped back onto the boardwalk, Eli was there, one shoulder against a post, hat tipped low. He didn't ask what was said. He'd heard enough through the open windows. "You don't have to come into town," he said. "I won't hide," she answered, meeting his eyes. There was steel in her voice, but also something tired. Clouds rolled in that afternoon, thick and fast. The sky bruised purple over the pastures, and wind tore at the fences they'd just repaired. By the time the first crack of thunder split the air, they were running for the house. Shutters slammed. The door rattled in its frame. Inside, Clara wrestled a stubborn window that refused to latch. Another gust burst through, snapping the hook clean off. The frame jolted, and her footing slipped on the worn rug. Eli's arm came around her waist before she hit the floor. "Solid, certain, careful," he murmured, close enough that she felt the words more than heard them. She steadied herself against his chest, aware of the heat through damp fabric, of how easily he held her without strain or spectacle. He wasn't proving anything. He was simply there. "You always catch falling things?" she asked, breath unsteady from more than the near fall. "Only the ones worth keeping," he said, not smiling. Lightning flared, bleaching the room white for a heartbeat. The storm howled, but the house held. He guided her away from the window toward the firelight and that same oak chair. "Sit," he said again, quieter this time. She did, trusting the strength beneath her without testing it. Eli crouched in front of her, not towering, not diminishing her, just level. His hands rested lightly on her knees, steady as the beams under the floor. "Underneath," he said, voice low against the thunder. "This place is built to hold weight, not break under it." Her throat tightened. No mockery, no challenge, just recognition. And for the first time, Clara felt the storm outside lose its power. The morning after the storm, the ranch looked washed clean. The sky stretched wide and pale. The earth dark and damp beneath Clara's boots as she stepped onto the porch. The air smelled like wet soil and cedar. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed, steady and unbothered. The world hadn't changed overnight, but she had. Eli stood near the railing, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sunrise roll across the fields. He glanced at her without surprise, as if he had expected her to be there beside him. "Storm passed," he said. Clara folded her arms against the cool air. So did something else. He studied her quietly, the way he always did, like he wasn't just seeing her shape, but the strength holding it upright. "You staying?" he asked after a moment. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even hope disguised as confidence. It was an honest question. She stepped off the porch and into the yard, boots sinking slightly into softened dirt. She turned back to him. "I don't shrink for anyone," she said evenly. "But I don't run either." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Good." The day unfolded like any other. Repairs to check, animals to feed, tools to dry from the rain. But something subtle had shifted. The ranch hands didn't whisper now. They worked alongside her without sideways glances. When a heavy beam needed moving near the barn, Clara lifted one end without being asked. Eli took the other. No spectacle, no commentary, just shared effort. By afternoon, sunlight warmed the soaked fields into rising mist. Clara paused near the fence line they had fixed days before. It stood straight, firm against the wind's memory. She ran her hand along the wood and felt the steadiness beneath it. Inside the house that evening, Eli stood near the fireplace, fingers brushing over the back of that oak chair. The same chair that had held her without complaint the day she arrived. "Built this before you came," he said quietly. She leaned against the doorway. "Why?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I figured someday someone would need a place that wouldn't break under them." Silence filled the room, not empty but warm. Clara stepped closer, resting her hand over his. I'm not fragile. I know. I'm not too much. His gaze softened, certain and unwavering. You're exactly enough. Outside, the land stretched wide and patient beneath the fading light. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt like she didn't have to prove she belonged. She simply did.